Okay, everyone, raise your hand if anyone in this room has ever gone through an obstacle or struggle in their life where they were even down on themselves in that struggle. Raise your hand. Good. I'm glad everybody did that because Kevin Hart certainly did. In this speech, I'll be hitting on three main points about Kevin Hart: how he went from growing up poor, how he grew up from having a drug addicted father around, and how he went from struggling comedy to being an inspiration to other people and to making it. So let's dive into it. According to Kevin Hart stated in an article with NBC that his father was a drug addict. He was always on drugs. So Kevin Hart saw firsthand what drugs can do to a man, and his brother saw it firsthand what it was doing to a person. So his mom used to say to Kevin, make sure your brother and you stay away from your father. He's a dangerous man. Stay away from him. He's not good. At the same time, Kevin saw that, without his father around doing any form of work to support his children and his family, Kevin saw firsthand what drugs can do to a man with being a dysfunctional father who is emotionally abusive and not there and being lousy. So Kevin Hart made a vow to himself that he was never going to be like his father and he was going to rise above that. The next main point is, now that I've talked about Kevin Hart growing up with a drug-addicted father, now let's dive into the next point, which is how he grew up being poor and what that was like for him. So, according to an article that he did with CNN, Kevin Hart stated in this article, titled, Kevin Hart, growing up from living poor to being a millionaire, Kevin Hart stated he and his younger brother and his mom lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a bunk bed, sharing it in the hallway with just the three of them. Kevin would be in the middle, his brother on the right, his mom on the left. So that was the lowest point of his life, he even would say. So then that itself, Kevin said that he used those moments in his life of living in a single apartment to motivate him that he was going to come out of that. So now that I've hit on Kevin Hart growing up with a drug-addicted father and what it was like for him being poor, before we go into the final part of how he made it, how he went to struggling comedy to succeeding and being an inspiration, let's dive into one last point. He said in an interview with Oprah that his mom was basically like, oh, Kevin, you want to be successful in comedy? He basically had a year to prove himself when he had no money whatsoever. So Kevin used to do gigs at comedy clubs at San Jose State and local like universities because he went to community college, and he said those were the lowest days of his life, even also being poor, young as also. But he used those moments again to motivate him to get out of it. So let's now that I've talked about 2 points, let's dive into the last main point, how he went from struggling comedy to doing really well, and how he in the end became an inspiration to millions of people. Kevin Hart basically, in order for him to get exposure, being a young comedian coming up, doing gigs at like universities and stuff and community colleges with very little money, he knew the only way to ever get exposure was to drive to New York City, and he lived in Philly. So according to an interview he did with the article titled Kevin Hart, Driving Long Drives to Philly to New York, and coming up, interview he did with CNBC, he drove from Philly to New York City and he would get home to Philly at 4 a.m. and he did that all the time just to commute back and forth to get gigs, to get exposure, and he was having very little money, and people would even boo him and throw a piece of chicken at him saying, you suck, you don't belong here, go away. But that in and of itself motivated him to come up, I'm going to keep trying, because it's only through practice and doing gigs at these clubs in New York and the colleges nearby that he was able to get it. So he went from struggling to being successful because he never gave up and he was relentless. Another key point is how he is now successful today and how he's an inspiration to people in his community and people everywhere. His motto is, if you work hard and you never give up and you keep being patient, the success will come. Just keep being patient. And he said this in an interview Facebook Live interview. So that's one key point. He also shares on his Instagram post, Hustle Hard Motivation, where he basically posts about working out and everything. He always talks about his struggles, and he says, I went from nothing to being something. So just don't give up, keep working hard, don't give up, and just trust in the process. So now that I've shared with you Kevin Hart growing up with a drug-addicted father, him growing up poor, and him sucking comedy and making it, and then in the end, being an inspiration to millions of people, I leave you here with this. Whenever you're going through a struggle, or you feel like you can't make it, or things are against you, just remember, if Kevin Hart can do it, so can you. Because he came from all the bad stuff, he could have easily given up, but he chose not to. So if he can make it, so can you. Thanks.